This will be a video about the Gemstone File, which has been called the greatest conspiracy theory of all time. And it's definitely a conspiracy theory. I feel a lot of times the term conspiracy theory is used to describe things that aren't conspiracies and they're not theories. But the Gemstone File is definitely a conspiracy theory and called the greatest one of all time. So what is it? It was like a 15, 20-page document that gained popularity around the 1970s, and it was written by a man who claimed that he was majorly connected to a group of very rich, very powerful people who essentially controlled the world. And because of these connections, he knew the true story behind Watergate, JFK assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, the disappearance of Howard Hughes, a whole bunch of things. And he wrote this the paper called the Gemstone File to reveal the true story of all these events. And I already did one on the Gemstone File. It was kind of like a 20-minute long overview that just kind of covered some of the main points and the main things that the Gemstone File talks about. This will be more of a deep dive into it, and it'll just kind of go through it entry by entry. It's arranged in chronological order, covering events from like the late 1930s up to the mid 1970s. And so this video will just kind of go through each entry and see if there's, documentation, newspaper archives, things like that that can substantiate some of these claims that are being made in the Gemstone File, because there's a lot of really incredible claims that are being made. So we're just going to give a quick minute-long overview to start things off, and then we'll jump into the actual Gemstone File. So this guy is Aristotle Onassis. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. A lot of people know him as the guy who married Jackie Kennedy after JFK's death, but there's way more to him than that. This guy was a freaking animal. So first of all, he was one of the richest people in the world at the time. And he lived on a private island in the Mediterranean Sea. It was named Scorpio. You can find pictures of this place online. It is like incredible. It's the most incredible residence you've ever seen. He owned a 300-foot yacht that was the biggest yacht in the world at the time, and it's considered like the world's first super yacht. You can find pictures of that as well. It's incredible. He owned the Monte Carlo casino the casino in Monte Carlo, and this was described as the most luxurious casino in the world at the time. He owned the Olympic Tower in New York City and Olympic Airlines, which was a big airline. And it's claimed he made all this money. He was a big shipping guy. He had a huge shipping empire. And he made all his money shipping oil and other things. And that's kind of like the quote unquote official story of how he made all his money. But according to the Gemstone file, he was the worldwide head of the mafia. He was basically the most powerful man alive, the guy behind the scenes who was influencing, orchestrating things for the mafia. And it's claimed, Gemstone claims at least, that he made all his money selling drugs. He was basically the world's biggest drug supplier, heroin in particular, opium. And it's not really that much of a stretch to imagine that this was indeed the case. Aristotle Onassis' official story is that he was penniless at 18. He was totally broke. And then he moved to Argentina, and he lived there for about a decade. And whatever happened in Argentina turned him from being penniless to being one of the richest people in the world. And then he moved back to the Greece area, or he moved to Scorpios, rather. And, this map is kind of like the main drug trade routes at the time. The opium always originated in like the Turkey Mediterranean area where Aristotle Onassis lived, and then either went to the U.S. or one of the main routes was down to Argentina. And again, Aristotle Onassis moved to Argentina when he was 18 years old. So to go from the area producing most of the opium to one of the main ports for where this opium went, and to go from penniless to being one of the richest people on earth, it's not a stretch at all to imagine that drugs were the source of his wealth. And then real quick here, the Gemstone File was written by this guy. His name is Bruce Roberts. He lived a really fascinating life. So he was one of the top jewelry designers in Hollywood throughout the 1940s and early 1950s. And he was a real expert in crystallography. Developed a way to create artificial gemstones, artificial diamonds, like in a lab. And apparently the gemstones that he would create were just the purest form. Like it was really good. And so gemstones, diamonds, were vital components for lasers. And lasers were like one of the big technologies, emerging technologies of this era. They were going to revolutionize the world. And Hughes Aerospace, owned by Howard Hughes, was one of the companies that was really doing a lot with lasers. Bruce Roberts ended up working with Hughes Aerospace because his gemstones, it just saved a lot of money to be able to create gemstones in a lab as opposed to mining them, which took a lot of time and a lot of money. And so he started working with Hughes Aerospace, and Hughes Aerospace and Howard Hughes factor prominently into the story that's called the Gemstone File. And so because Bruce Roberts had access to some of the really high up people at Hughes Aerospace, it's believed that some of the high up people were the ones feeding him information about what was really happening with Howard Hughes and some of the people around him. And Bruce Roberts also was married to the daughter of the French consulate to Indochina. So his father-in-law was the French consulate to Indochina. This is the region where most of the opium originated from the opium fields. And then this is supposedly how Aristotle Onassis made all his money, was getting opium from this region and shipping it all around the world. And so apparently it was kind of an open secret, or it was common knowledge among the politicians in this area about the opium trade and who was involved. But they all either turned a blind eye to it or remained quiet out of fear. And so it's believed Bruce Roberts' father-in-law also was passing him information. And then lastly, so basically Bruce Roberts started writing about all these things he was learning. Initially, his files were over 1,000 pages long, and another writer named Stephanie Caruana read his files and condensed it into a 20-page document And this is the document that really became pretty popular throughout the 1970s. It first appeared right around like 1975 on college campuses and in underground groups. And then from there, people would print it off, pass it to their friends. Those friends would pass it to their friends. And it just kind of spread throughout the nation that way. It was a pretty popular document back in the day, but it's kind of been forgotten about since then. So anyway, let's jump into it. So this is the very first entry for the Gemstone file. And it says Onassis, a Greek drug pusher and ship owner who made his first million selling Turkish tobacco in Argentina, worked out a profitable deal with Joseph Kennedy, Eugene Meyer, and Meyer Lansky. Onassis would ship directly into Boston for Joseph Kennedy. Also involved was a heroin deal with Franklin and Elliott Roosevelt. So first off, Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad, was definitely connected to the mob. That's pretty well known. There's been a number of books written about, how basically how corrupt he was and a lot of the very unsavory people that he was friends with. And it's always been believed that he made a lot of his money bootlegging alcohol during Prohibition. Some people say that's the case, but a lot of people believe that is the case. And one interesting thing about Joe Kennedy is in 1937, he became chairman of this thing called the United States Maritime Commission. And one of their roles, one of the responsibilities that they had was selling excess United States like ships, naval ships, things like that. And it just so happened that a lot of these ships ended up being sold to Aristotle Onassis and some other Greek shipping people for just like bargain rates, like dirt cheap rates. So Joe Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis definitely knew each other. Joe Kennedy's Maritime Commission was the one that sold Aristotle Onassis these ships at dirt cheap prices that helped him build his shipping empire. And then the second part of this initial Gemstone entry says also involved was a heroin deal with Franklin and Elliott Roosevelt. Now, that's obviously a pretty explosive claim. Franklin Roosevelt was obviously the president of the United States. But interestingly, Franklin Roosevelt's grandfather was this guy, Warren Delano, who is like one of the all-time biggest drug dealers in the history of the country. He just made an absolute fortune. I guess he smuggled opium into China. So again, it involves opium. And so, on the surface, something like Franklin Roosevelt being involved in heroin might sound pretty crazy or might sound hard to believe, but the fact that his grandfather was involved in this, I don't think it's that much of a stretch to imagine that he could have just gone into the family business and made money that way. So here's the second entry. Eugene Meyer buys the Washington Post to get control of the news media. Other mafia buys up other papers, broadcasting, TV, etc. And news censorship of all major news media goes into effect. And this did happen around this time. Most of the major newspapers started getting sold. Eugene Meyer did buy the Washington Post. And interestingly, Eugene Meyer was chairman of the Federal Reserve before he bought the Washington Post. And then Eugene Meyer's daughter was Catherine Meyer, Catherine Graham, who ran the Washington Post forever, and she's celebrated in a bunch of movies. Next entry is World War II was very profitable for Onassis, Rockefeller, Kennedy's, Roosevelt's, IG Farben, etc. Onassis sold arms, oil, and dope to both sides, went through the war without losing a single ship or man. All right, so this is where it starts getting good, and we get into the Howard Hughes stuff. So Howard Hughes, a Texas millionaire, is meanwhile buying his way towards control of the U.S. electoral process with a view towards his own personal gain. He buys senators, governors, etc. And he finally buys his last politician, the newly elected Vice President Richard Nixon, via a $250,000 non-repayable loan to Richard Nixon's brother Donald. And so Howard Hughes plays a really prominent role throughout the Gemstone Files. So We'll just talk about him really briefly here in case you're unfamiliar with him. Basically, throughout the 1930s and 40s, Howard Hughes was like the world's biggest celebrity. He was the world's biggest inventor, and he was one of the richest people in the world. He was like Elon Musk crossed with like Brad Pitt or Leonardo DiCaprio. He ran multiple billion-dollar companies that were involved in everything from building planes to offshore drilling to his medical institute, which was doing like a lot of cutting-edge medical research. Howard Hughes was an avid flyer, and he set multiple world records for speed, and these were all in planes that he built himself. And this was like a big deal back in the day, like flying around the globe and seeing who could have the fastest trip around the globe. For whatever reason, people back then were like obsessed with this. And anytime Howard Hughes would embark on one of his trips, it was just constantly front page news. They would constantly print updates in the newspaper. And whenever he got back, there was just these massive parades with thousands of people. And he was there right in the middle of it all, waving like a politician and going through the streets. He also owned TWA, which was one of the biggest airlines at the time. And as a fun little side hustle, he bought a movie studio. He owned RKO Pictures, which was one of the 5 biggest movie studios at the time. And he just kind of started producing movies. And again, it was just kind of like a side hustle. He was more focused on his businesses, but he just figured, what the hell, I'll buy a movie studio and start making movies. And another thing about him is he's like an all-time womanizer. If you look at his Wikipedia page, the list of ladies, A-list actresses, and other well-known ladies, list of people he was involved with is so long it takes up 3 lines. He was just constantly photographed with women, constantly moving from one woman to the next. And his Hughes Aerospace company is really interesting because this was basically the Tesla of the day. They were doing all this cutting edge research and experiments on the early stages of like space exploration. And one of the things they were really involved with was laser technology. Laser technology was, going to be this incredible technology that was going to revolutionize the world. And as we mentioned, Bruce Roberts was who wrote the Gemstone File, had created these gemstones, these diamonds that he could create in a lab, and they were of such high quality that he started working with Hughes Aerospace in their laser research. And so that's supposedly how he got a lot of the information that he includes in the Gemstone File. So basically the point is Howard Hughes up until the mid-1950s was absolutely everywhere. He was the biggest celebrity, the biggest inventor. Everyone knew him. Everyone admired him. And Gemstone also mentioned that basically his thing that he was focused on right now, or at this time, is 1956, was he was just constantly buying off and paying off politicians in order to get like favorable things passed for his companies. And one of the things he did do, and this was, kind of a big deal at the time, or actually it was years later that it was revealed, but he did give Richard Nixon's brother, Donald Nixon, a $250,000 non-repayable loan, which, non-repayable loan is basically a bribe. That's a fancy way of saying a bribe. And the reason that became such a big issue was kind of leads into this next entry in the Gemstone File. So in early 1957, Vice President Nixon repays the favor for the $250,000 non-repayable loan by having the IRS Treasury grant tax-free status refused twice before to Hughes Medical Foundation, the sole owner of Hughes Aircraft, creating a tax-free, non-accountable money funnel for whatever Hughes wanted to do. And the U.S. government also shoved antitrust suits against Hughes's TWA, etc. And this did happen. He basically restructured his companies so this Howard Hughes Medical Institute was the owner of each one of his companies, and he constantly tried to get tax-free status for this Hughes Medical Institute. It was constantly rejected. Then after he gave Richard Nixon's brother this loan, Howard Hughes Medical Institute was approved for tax-free status. So now all his profits from all his companies was under this medical institute umbrella, and he wasn't getting taxed on it. Okay, so this is where it gets really good. So in March 1957, Aristotle Onassis carries out a carefully planned event. He has Hughes kidnapped from his bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel using Hughes's own men, Chester Davis, born Cesare in Sicily, etc. Hughes's men either quit, get fired, or stay on in the new Onassis organization. A few days later, Mayor Cannon of Nevada, now Senator Cannon, arranges a fake marriage to Jean Peters to explain Hughes's lost interest in dating movie stars. Hughes, battered and brain damaged in the scuffle, is taken to the Emerald Isle Hotel in the Bahamas. The entire top floor has been rented for the Hughes party. There he is shot full of heroin for 30 days and later dragged off to a cell on Onassis' island Scorpios. Onassis now has a much larger power base in the U.S., the Hughes Empire, as well as control over Phoenix and other Hughes-purchased politicians. And then L. Wayne Rector, Hughes' double since 1957, becomes Hughes. This is obviously pretty explosive, and the interesting thing is this entry says this was in March 1957. And right around this time, something really strange happened in that Howard Hughes vanished off the face of the earth. And I'm convinced that the disappearance of Howard Hughes, this is the absolute strangest story I ever heard. I'm going to do a full video on it at some point that just kind of goes into it all because it is the weirdest thing of all time. It was claimed that he just kind of went crazy and locked himself away from everyone, and he turned into this big germaphobe and refused to interact with people and just lived out of his like hotel room. He eventually supposedly died in 1976, and even when he died, there were all these articles about how he hadn't been seen in public since 1953, hadn't been seen in public since the mid 1950s. So essentially, he just vanished off the face of the earth around the mid 1950s, which is exactly when the Gemstone File claims that Aristotle Onassis actually kidnapped Hughes and held him as a prisoner on his island. And so, obviously, the fact that, you know, one of the most famous, most well-known people in the world could be kidnapped and held as a prisoner for, you know, almost 2 decades seems pretty hard to believe, but there was so much weird stuff going on with Howard Hughes around this time. So one thing was this John Meyer guy. This guy was kind of like a legend in his own right. He was Howard Hughes's, officially at least, he was Howard Hughes's press agent. Unofficially, he was the guy who was basically this humongous party animal who took out politicians and other rich people on behalf of Hughes all the time, and literally hooked him up with like prostitutes and women. And this guy, you can kind of find stories about him if you Google him. He's usually known as Johnny Meyer, and apparently he was kind of a legend. And he was the second in command in Howard Hughes's empire up until the mid 1950s, when surprisingly he went to work for Aristotle Onassis. This is the two of them in this picture. So this Johnny Meyer guy, who was Hughes' second in command, went to work for Aristotle Onassis. This guy was Noah Dietrich. He was Hughes' right-hand man. He was like the guy who ran all his business empire. He left in 1957. So if you remember the Gemstone entry, it said that everyone in the Hughes organization was either fired or they quit or they were just bought out to turn a blind eye to what was going on. And so what happened was after Johnny Meyer here and Noah Dietrich left, this group called the Mormon Mafia moved in and basically controlled the Howard Hughes empire. And not a lot is known about these guys. They were said to be, in the 2 decades from the mid 1950s up until he died, they were said to be the only people who ever interacted with Howard Hughes. And it's rare to find that much info about these guys. One of the head guy of the Mormon Mafia was named Frank William Gay, and actually his family, his relatives, featured on this Real Housewives of Salt Lake City show, in case you watch that. And then so the Mormon Mafia came in to control the Hughes empire right around the time that Johnson says he was kidnapped. And something else that happened was this guy, Robert Mayhew, came in, and he became basically the overseer of the entire. And this guy had major connections to the mafia, which we'll get into because this guy is really fascinating and he plays a major role in this. But the interesting thing is he controlled Howard Hughes's empire for 15 years and never once met Howard Hughes. They only worked together via memos. So it's just really, this whole Howard Hughes thing is the absolute strangest thing. I'm totally going to do a full video on this because, I mean, there's just so many bizarre aspects to this. This is another thing that's very interesting. So these pictures ran in a Canadian newspaper. They were taken by a tourist, and this is Aristotle Onassis' island Scorpios, and it's of really old, really like seemingly frail man being helped out of a wheelchair and being helped to walk. And these ran in a Canadian newspaper, wondering if this was Howard Hughes. And these are some of the quotes from that article. So the top one is just the guy who took the photos. I took the photos from a cruise ship, Oriana. We passed close to Scorpios. And then they also had an interview in the article with the nurse who worked on the island. So she says, I was hired because I have a good knowledge of English. Mr. Onassis told me that the patient I would be caring for was an Englishman. The job was on the island of Tenos. I was paid a high salary to go there. That people who talk about Mr. Onassis' personal business do not work for him long. There were 3 doctors and 2 nurses, and 2 doctors at Mr. Onassis' private hospital in Tenos, but there was only 1 patient. I thought that at the time he was about 50, but he could have been older or younger. Hughes would have been 63 at the time. We had to feed him, bathe him, clean up after him. Sometimes he would listen to us talk. It was seldom any said that he understood. Mostly he just stared. She also described him as quite tall, well over 6 feet tall, and Howard Hughes was 6'3". He weighed practically nothing, just skin and bones, no muscles. He was helpless like a baby. His body was wasted away. So again, remember, Gemstone says that that Howard Hughes was kidnapped and then just constantly injected with heroin until he basically wasted away to nothing. And then the Gemstone file entry also said, which I think is the coming entry, does also say that Howard Hughes was battered and brain damaged. The stuff apparently they really roughed him up when they kidnapped him. And this old individual right here, who just happens to be on Aristotle Onassis' island, had apparently a really bad head injury, and the nurse described that as well. She said, one of the worst I've ever seen. The entire back of his head was a scarred mess. It had been operated on several times. There was a metal plate under the skin to protect the brain where the bone was broken away. I was told part of the brain was removed years ago. From the condition of the man, I could only assume that it was true. So this is definitely pretty interesting that there was this random, mysterious old guy who was pretty much helpless, who just happened to be being kept on Aristotle Onassis' island Scorpios. And then lastly, also in the entry, in the Gemstone entry, they talked about how the cover story, and this did happen, the cover story for why Howard Hughes just vanished off the face of the earth and never dated anyone ever again. You know, he went from dating every major actress in Hollywood up until the mid-1950s, where he just stopped dating completely. That's one of the many strange aspects of his, quote unquote, going crazy or his disappearance. But the cover story that came out was that, he married this lady, Jean Peters here. She was an actress. And that's why he, isn't chasing women anymore. And Gemstone says this marriage was arranged and overseen and notarized or whatever by this guy, Howard Cannon, who was the city attorney for Las Vegas. And then this guy, Howard Cannon, was rewarded by being named a senator in the next election. And the mafia just helped him get elected as a senator in the next election. And that did happen. He got elected as a senator from Nevada in 1959. So as mentioned, there's just so much weird stuff. This Howard Hughes thing, I won't get into everything because this video would be really long, and I plan on doing just a video just about Howard Hughes. this is just one example. Like right in 1957, which is when Gemstone claims Hughes was kidnapped, this article appeared that Howard Hughes' home was searched by police on suspicion of a felony. That it had reported that some sort of felony had happened in his home, and police went and searched it. And then one of the quotes from the article, it was from a police captain, I think it was. He said, "We have reason to believe that there was foul play involved." And so there's just so much weird stuff about the Howard Hughes thing. I can't wait for the next video because it'll be a good one. So also in 1957, Joseph Kennedy takes John F. and Jackie Onassis to see Onassis on his yacht, introduce John, and remind Onassis of an old mafia promise, the presidency for Kennedy, and Onassis agrees. And then in 1959, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba from dictator Batista, thereby destroying the cozy and lucrative mafia gambling empire run for Onassis by Meyer Lansky. Onassis scoops up $8 million in mafia receipts, and Onassis is furious. So this did happen. Fidel Castro took over power, and before he took over power, Cuba was basically this paradise for the mafia, where they owned all the casinos, they controlled the oil drilling wells. They owned a lot. They controlled a lot of farm, and they were just making tons of money. And then Fidel Castro comes in, and right there you can see he nationalized all these American businesses. So instead of the profits going to all these mafia people who owned all this land and all this business in Cuba, profits would go back into the country. And he even shut down the casinos for a while. Finally reopened them. But this basically caused the mafia to absolutely hate Fidel Castro. And that comes into play a little bit later on too here. So in 1959, there's a stirring election battle between Kennedy and Nixon. Either way, because he has control over both candidates. And JFK was elected. American people are happy. Onassis is happy, and the mafia is ecstatic. Roberts brings his synthetic rubies. So Bruce Roberts is the guy who wrote this. He brings his synthetic rubies, the original gemstones, to Hughes aircraft in Los Angeles, and they steal his rubies, the basis for laser beam research, laser bombs, etc., because of the optical quality of the rubies. Roberts was also married to the daughter of the former French consul in Indochina. In that area, Onassis' involvement in the Golden Triangle dope trade was no secret. Roberts' investigation revealed the Onassis-Hughes connection, kidnap, and switch. So that just kind of gets into like who Bruce Roberts was. I think I mentioned most of this already, but he was definitely no random guy who was just making all this up. He had serious connections to a lot of this stuff. Okay, and then in January 1961, the entry reads, Joseph Kennedy had a stroke ending his control over John and Bobby. The boys decided to rebel against Onassis' control. Why? Intermafia struggle, perhaps a dim hope of restoring this country to its mythical integrity? They began committing mafia no-nos, arrested Wally Bird, owner of Air Thailand, who had been shipping Onassis' heroin out of the Golden Triangle under contract with the CIA, arrested Teamster Mafia Jimmy Hoffa and put him in jail. And this did happen just very, very shortly, right after JFK was elected, or inaugurated, rather. His dad had a massive stroke that left him just basically a vegetable. He was unable to talk. He was unable to move. He was in a wheelchair. And he just really couldn't do anything. And, you know, it's pretty well known. It's pretty commonly known that the Kennedys did kind of go to war with the mafia around this time. Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, the top cop in the land, and he did start arresting a lot of mafia people. That headline, conviction of organized criminals, grew by 350% when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General. So this definitely did happen, where all of a sudden after JFK was inaugurated, they really did kind of declare like a war on the mafia and start arresting people. Yeah, that's basically what this says. And so in April 1961, the CIA, with Pigs fiasco, Hunt McCord, CIA, Batista's Cubans, and Mafia angry about JFK's lack of enthusiasm. Mafia Onassis has a U.S. right-hand man, Hughes' top aide, Former CIA, FBI, and CIA Robert Mayhew, nicknamed IBM for Iron Bob Mayhew, hire and train an mafia assassination team to get Castro. The team of a dozen or so includes Johnny Rosselli and Jimmy the Weasel Piano, expert mafia hitmen, assisted by CIA, Hunt, and McCord, and others. This was reported recently by Jack Anderson, who gets a lot of his tips from his friend Frank Sturgis, also on the Castro assassination team. The team tries 5 times to kill Castro with everything from long-range rifles to apple pie served with sodium morphate in it, and Castro survives. So this did happen. Basically, the U.S. government and the mafia both had a mutual interest in eliminating Fidel Castro. They both wanted him out of Cuba. The mafia wanted their profits back, and the U.S. government just didn't think Fidel Castro's government was very friendly towards them. And so they both wanted him out. And basically, what happened here, and this is all documented, Gemstone is totally right on this, is this guy, Robert Mayhew, who we met earlier, who in 1957 became the overseer of the Howard Hughes empire after Howard Hughes supposedly went crazy. Then this Robert Mayhew guy never once met Howard Hughes in the 17 or 18 years that he worked for him. The CIA reached out to he was a former CIA agent as well. And what happened was the CIA reached out to him and said, okay, we want Fidel Castro dead, and we want you to put together a mafia team, an assassination team, to kill him. And they gave him the name of a guy named John Rosselli, who could kind of help put this team together. John Rosselli is a pretty well-known mafia figure from this era. So first of all, this was under oath that Robert Mayhew described this whole plot. And then Johnny Rosselli also described his role in this CIA plot to kill Castro. And so Gemstone is 100% right on how this went down. It claims that they tried to kill Fidel Castro 5 times, and they failed every single time. But this has all been documented, and there's been testimony about it over the years. So in 1963, members of the Castro assassination team arrested Link Pontchartrain, Louisiana, by Bobby Kennedy's Justice Boys. Angered, Onassis stops trying to kill Castro, and he changes targets and goes for the head, JFK, who, according to Onassis, welched on a mafia deal. So this is setting up like basically a rumble between JFK's team and Onassis' team. And so Onassis has now targeted JFK and wants to kill him. And so in August 1963, 2 murders had to occur before the murder of JFK. 2 murders of people who would understand the situation and might squawk. Senator Kefauver, whose crime commission investigations had uncovered the 1932 deal between Onassis, Kennedy, Eugene Meyer, Lansky, Roosevelt, etc. Kefauver planned a speech on the Senate floor denouncing mafia operations. Instead, he ate a piece of apple pie laced with sodium morphate and had a sodium morphate-induced heart attack on the Senate floor. Philip Graham, editor of the Washington Post, was the second one who had to be killed. Philip had married Catherine Meyer, Eugene Meyer's daughter, who inherited the Washington Post and the Allied media empire. Philip Graham put together the Kennedy-Johnson ticket and was Kennedy's friend in the struggle with Onassis. According to Gemstone, Catherine Meyer Graham bribed some psychiatrists to certify that Phil was insane. He was allowed out of the nut house for the weekend and died of a shotgun wound in the head in Graham home in Washington, and the death was ruled a suicide. And so Gemstone is saying that these 2 very close allies of JFK had to be eliminated before they could go forward with this assassination plot. And this guy, Estes Kefauver, he was pretty well known at the time as being a senator who was just 100% focused on exposing organized crime and opening up a ton of investigations into organized crime figures. He was very, very popular at the time. There was even speculation that he would run for president. And just as Gemstone says, he had a heart attack on the floor of the Senate one day and eventually died. And his whole crime hearings, this was like a really big deal. back when they were happening, and he was, a very close ally of JFK's. And then Phil Graham was another close ally of JFK's. He was the publisher of the Washington Post. And just as Gemstone says, he was, for some reason, committed to a mental asylum and then released one weekend, and he supposedly blew his head off with a shotgun, and it was ruled a suicide. Gemstone is saying that he had to be eliminated because he had a lot of power controlling the Washington Post. And it's very, very interesting here how Gemstone says both these people had to be eliminated, and they both, if you look at the dates, they both died a week apart in August of 1963. So this was just a few months before JFK was killed. So you do kind of have to wonder if maybe Gemstone was onto something here. So November 1st, 1963, the hit on JFK was supposed to take place in true mafia style, a triple execution together with Diem and New in Vietnam. Diem and New got theirs as scheduled. Onassis had invited Jackie for a cruise on the Christina, where she was when JFK got tipped off the big plane to wipe him out. JFK called Jackie on the yacht from the White House hysterical. Get off that yacht if you have to swim. And he canceled his appearance at a football game in Chicago, where the CIA mafia assassination team was poised for the kill. One of the assassination team, Tom Valley, a double for Oswald, was picked up in Chicago with a rifle and then quickly released by police. And it's like this that really makes me believe that Bruce Roberts definitely did have some sort of insider info, because hardly anyone knew about the Chicago assassination plot when the Gemstone file was written. But this did happen. I did a video on this. It is an absolutely crazy story. Basically, 3 weeks before he was killed in Dallas, there was supposed to be JFK was supposed to be killed in Chicago when he was in town to attend the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field, and there was a full assassination team waiting for him. This almost went down, and it was exposed by the guy Abraham Bolden, who was the first Secret Service agent assigned to presidential protection. And JFK canceled his trip at the last minute, and this didn't happen. But there was this guy, Thomas Arthur Valley, on the left. He was basically a spitting image of Lee Harvey Oswald. They had so much in common that, anyone who's looked into this believes that he was kind of like the Lee Harvey Oswald of the Chicago assassination plot. He was going to be the guy blamed for it and arrested and paraded in front of everyone. There's, been kind of some stories about this Chicago assassination plot in the years since. At the time, in the early 1970s, hardly anybody knew about this, and all this info only came out years later. So the fact that the Gemstone file mentions not only this plot, but it also mentions Thomas Arthur Valley by name, really lends me to believe that Bruce Roberts knew something. That's, as I mentioned, I did a video on the Chicago plot to kill JFK if you want to learn more. And then it's very interesting that Gemstone mentions that the assassination of JFK was supposed to be a true mafia, true mafia style, a triple execution together with Diem and New in Vietnam. So I guess maybe that's just like a mafia thing, like people are killed in threes. But this did happen where Diem, who was the leader of South Vietnam, and his brother, who was the leader of or was like a really high up military officer, they were both killed on November 2nd, 1963, with the exact date that JFK was supposed to be killed in Chicago. And Gemstone says that isn't a coincidence. It was supposed to be like a mafia type triple execution. There's some significance to that. And, it's pretty remarkable that that is indeed the case. And another thing that Gemstone talks about in this entry is that Jackie Kennedy was on Aristotle Onassis's yacht at the time. So she was, and this did happen, and it's very strange, especially in light of some of the things that happen later on with the Gemstone file that we'll get into. But Jackie Kennedy did visit Greece for a 2-week rest in October, right there, that article. And so she was on Aristotle Onassis's yacht at the time that this assassination was supposed to go down. And there's some really weird stuff about this. So basically what happened was Jackie Kennedy, the first lady, visited Greece and was on Aristotle Onassis's yacht. And then right there in the upper right-hand corner, what happened was the yacht got lost. No one knew where it was. No one knew where the first lady was. And so the whereabouts of luxury yacht Christina carrying Mrs. John F. Kennedy on a vacation cruise remained a mystery. So no one had any idea where the first lady was around that time. And it's almost like unfathomable to think that there wasn't like a secret service protection or anything like that following her, or some sort of security either by her side or following in a boat. But apparently that wasn't the case, because they had no idea where she was. And then there was this really weird story as well about how the government, a government official complained that the government held back data on government payments to Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis until Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy had ended a Mediterranean tour on his island. So basically, they were holding back payments to Aristotle Onassis until Mrs. Jackie Kennedy, JFK's wife, had ended a Mediterranean tour on his yacht. So they were holding back payments until she ended the tour. It almost sounds like it's like a ransom situation where she was being held on the boat for money, or they were at least worried about her safety. And so they said, hey, we're going to stop paying you until she's released safely back to us. I don't know. It's a really weird. We'll kind of get into this a bit more in a little later on, because obviously Jackie Kennedy ended up marrying Aristotle Onassis. That's one of the entries coming up in the Gemstone File. But this is just such a bizarre story. And so now we get into the JFK assassination, and I personally think the Gemstone File honestly nails this explanation for the Kennedy assassination. I think they're just dead on, or at least very, very close to what actually went down that day. So 3 weeks, so November 22nd, 1963, 3 weeks, the Mafia's alternate and carefully arranged execution plan went into effect. JFK was assassinated at Dallas. A witness who recognized pictures of some of the people arrested in Dealey Plaza as having been arrested in Chicago 3 weeks earlier told Black Panthers Hampton and Clark. The JFK murder, Onassis Hughes man Robert May, so the JFK murder, Onassis and Hughes's man Robert Mayhew reassigned the Mafia CIA Castro assassination team the murder of JFK. So you remember earlier we talked about how Robert Mayhew put together this CIA contacted him to put together an assassination team to get Castro. Now he reassigned that team to the murder of JFK, and he added Eugene Brading, a third Mafia hitman from the Denver Mafia Smaldanese family. 2 months earlier, Brading, on parole after a series of crimes, applied for a new driver's license, explaining to the California DMV that he had tried to change his name. Brading got his California parole officer's permission for 2 trips to Dallas in November on oil business, quote unquote. The first time to look things over, and the second time when JFK was scheduled for his Dallas trip. So of everything that says, this is kind of like the main sentence is Robert Mayhew reassigned the Mafia CIA Castro assassination team to the murder of JFK. So again, this Mafia CIA Castro assassination team did exist. Robert Mayhew testified under oath about how it was formed. And this guy, Johnny Rosselli, was one of the main components of this assassination team. This is all very well known, um, of the Castro assassination team. And this article over here on the right is interesting. It says before he died, Rosselli hinted to associates that he knew who had arranged President Kennedy's murder. It was the same conspirators, he suggested, whom he had recruited earlier to kill Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. So that's what I just said is exactly what Johnny Rosselli is just saying here, in that they put together this team to kill Fidel Castro a little while before this. That team failed, and then they just took this existing team, didn't have to reinvent the wheel or anything, and they assigned the team to kill JFK. And so this guy, Bill Bonanno, his dad was the crime boss for the La Cosa Nostra crime family. Bill Bonanno wrote a book and claimed that John Rosselli was the primary man in the plot to kill JFK. That's exactly, what Gemstone said. This guy who was the son of the La Cosa Nostra crime boss said the same thing. And again, I mean, one interesting thing about this is interesting, but this book was published in 2011. So Gemstone was written in 1975, 50 years ago, and it contains all this information that, years or even decades down the road has come out to support the statements that are being made in the Gemstone file. But again, this was written 50 years ago, so it's just incredible that someone could compile all this information and put it all together without truly knowing what was going on. I just don't see how someone could just blindly make all this stuff up off the top of their head. And the interesting thing here also is that John Rosselli was scheduled to testify in a reinvestigation into the JFK murder in 1976. And again, he's the guy who Gemstone fingers as the man responsible for killing JFK. He's also the guy who Bill Bonanno says was responsible for killing JFK. And before Johnny Rosselli could testify in this investigation, his body was found in the Atlantic Ocean in an oil drum with its legs cut off. So clearly someone did not want him talking about what he knew about the JFK assassination. And then this other guy, Eugene Brading, according to Gemstone, he was another member of this assassination team. And this is one of the most suspicious people in the JFK assassination, if you look into him. So he was a California gangster. He'd been arrested something like 30, 40 times. He was on probation at the time, so he had to check in with a probation officer in Texas. And he went to Texas like 2-3 weeks before the assassination, and then he also went back. He just happened to be in Texas when JFK was killed, and he just happened to be in Dealey Plaza when JFK was killed. And he was actually arrested temporarily at the scene of the crime, and then he was let go. He gave a fake name, and he was let go. And it just seems pretty coincidental that this California gangster who, like I said, he's been arrested like 30, 40 times, he just happened to be in Dealey Plaza the day that JFK was killed. And kind of gets into more detail with this next entry. So Lee Harvey Oswald, CIA, with carefully links to both the ultra-right and the communists, was designated as the patsy. He was supposed to shoot at Governor Connolly, and he did. Each of the four shooters, Oswald, Brading, Fratiano, and Rosselli, had a timer and a backup man. Backup men were supposed to pick up the spent shells and get rid of the guns. Timers would give the signal to shoot. Hunt and McCord were there to help. Sturgis was in Miami. Fratiano shot from a second-story window in the Daltex building across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. He apparently used a handgun. He is an excellent shot with a pistol. Fratiano hit Kennedy twice in the back of the head. Fratiano and his backup man were arrested, driven away from the Daltex building in a police car, and released without being booked. Rosselli shot Kennedy once, hitting him in the side of the head and blowing his brains out with a rifle from behind a fence in the grassy knoll area. Rosselli and his timer went down a manhole behind the fence and followed the sewer line away from Dealey Plaza. So if you're familiar with the JFK, you're going to recognize a lot of these things: Dealey Plaza, Daltex building, the sewer line. Just kind of tied them together. And then the third part of the triangular shootout was supplied by Eugene Brading, shooting from Kennedy's left from a small pagoda at Dealey Plaza across the street from the grassy knoll. Brading missed because Rosselli and Fratiano's shot had just hit Kennedy in the head from the right and the rear nearly simultaneously. Brading's shot hit the curb and ricocheted off. Brading was photographed on the scene stuffing his gun under his coat. He wore a big leather hat, its headband marked with large conspicuous X's. Police had been instructed to let anyone with an X-marked hat band through the police lines, and some may have told they were Secret Service. So there's a lot of information there, but we'll start kind of at the end here. I've mentioned this Eugene Brading guy is really one of the just very suspicious people involved. He's the California gangster who just happened to be in Dealey Plaza the day that Kennedy was killed. Now, Gemstone says the police officers, I guess, were instructed to let anyone who had white X's on their headbands through like police lines to not bother them. They might have been told they were Secret Service. This is Eugene Brading in this photograph, and he has these white X's on his hat. So again, that's pretty unbelievable that, Gemstone mentions that, and there's photographic evidence that, supports that. This kind of goes into more detail. After his shot, Brading ditched his gun. This is a continuation of what Gemstone File, its explanation for the Kennedy assassination. So after his shot, Brading ditched his gun with his backup man and walked up the street toward the Daltex building. Robert Craig, deputy sheriff, rushed up to Brading, assuming he was Secret Service, quote unquote, because of his hat. He told him he had just seen a man come out of the book depository and jump into a station wagon. Brading was uninterested. Brading walked into the Daltex building to, quote, make a phone call. There he was arrested by another deputy sheriff, showed his Jim Braden driver's license, he gave a fake name, and was quickly released without being booked. Oswald shot Connolly twice from the Texas School Book Depository. He split from the scene, and his backup man was supposed to take the rifle out of the building, or so Oswald thought. Instead, he hid it behind some boxes where it would be found later. Okay, so basically Gemstone is saying there were 4 shooters that day, and it was just sort of like a triangulated shootout, and each of these 4 people were supposed to shoot and then drop their gun and get out of there. And they each had a backup man who was designated as the person who would pick up their gun and get rid of everything, get rid of any sort of evidence that might be left behind. And what it's saying is this is how they kind of framed Lee Harvey Oswald or screwed him over, is they told him to shoot Governor Connolly and then just set your gun down and get out of there, and your backup man will be getting rid of the gun. And then the backup man didn't do that. They just left the gun there. And this, did happen, or at least Lee Harvey Oswald did leave his gun behind. And I've always found this to be like one of the strangest things about the Kennedy assassination, how Lee Harvey Oswald was shooting from this window. He shot someone. He shot Governor Connolly, or he shot JFK. So he just shot someone, just assassinated someone, and you just set your gun down by the window and leave. Like, his fingerprints were on the gun and everything. So it's like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you at least try to conceal the gun or try to smuggle it out or do something? Because obviously this is a picture of how the gun was actually found up on top there. Obviously, just leaving the gun like that, of course somebody is going to find it. It's the most obvious thing ever. So it makes no sense at all that he would shoot someone, potentially even shooting the president of the United States of America, and then just leave his gun in plain sight right by where he shot from. And again, this was kind of some of the key evidence that, supposedly proved that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin, was because they found his gun and they found his fingerprints on it. And so this is another continuation of the Gemstone account of what happened The Kennedy assassination, so 3 men dressed as tramps picked up the spent shells from Dealey Plaza. It was Howard Hunt. They drifted into an empty boxcar sitting on the railway behind the grassy knoll area and waited. A Dallas police officer ordered 2 Dallas cops to go over to the boxcar and pick up the tramps. The 3 tramps paraded around Dealey Plaza to the police department in the Dow Tex building. They were held there until the alarm went out to pick up Oswald. Then they were released without being booked. And all 10 men were arrested immediately after the shooting. All were released soon after, and none were booked. And not a word about their existence is mentioned in the Warren report. Century talks about the 3 tramps, and this has always been kind of like a big controversy when it comes to the JFK assassination. These 3 people here were arrested in a boxcar, like a train car, pretty close to the assassination site, and their identities have always been kind of speculated about. Gemstone claims Howard Hunt is one of them, and Frank Sturgis is one of them. He was another big gangster of the time. It's interesting that they say this. There's always been speculation about who these 3 tramps are. It's even been rumored that Charles Harrison is one of them. He's Woody Harrelson, the actor's dad. It's also been speculated that Thomas Arthur Valley, who was the assassin for the Chicago assassination plot that almost went down 3 weeks before this, it's even claimed that he could be one of them. So I just wanted to include that just so you know who Gemstone claims they are. And so this is the final part of what Gemstone says about the JFK assassination. So regarding Lee Harvey Oswald, Officer Tippit was dispatched in his police radio to the Oak Cliff section where Oswald had rented a room. Tippit may have met Oswald on the street. He may have been supposed to kill Oswald, but something went wrong. Tippit by 2 men using 2 revolvers. The witness, Domingo Benavidez, who used Tippit's police radio report, "We've had a shooting here," may have been one of the men who shot him. Domingo Benavidez appears in connection with the Luther King shooting also. Oswald went to the movies. A shoe store manager told the theater cashier that a suspicious-looking man had sneaked in without paying. 15 assorted cops and the FBI charged into the movie theater to look for the guy who had sneaked in. Oswald had a pistol that wouldn't fire. It may have been anticipated that the police would shoot the cop killer for, quote, resisting arrest. But since that didn't happen, the Dallas police brought Oswald out for small-time mafia Jack Ruby to kill 2 days later. Brading stated the Teamster Mafia Hoffa financed Cabana Motel in Dallas, and Ruby got to the Cabana the night before the murder, says the Warren report. And the rest, as they say, is history. Onassis was so confident of his control over the police, media, FBI, Secret Service, CIA, and the U.S. judicial system that he had JFK murdered right before the eyes of the nation, then systematically bought off, killed, or framed all of the witnesses, and had the evidence destroyed, then put a 75-year seal of secrecy over the matter. And it is true that so many witnesses to the JFK murder and so many people who were involved, or at least, were there on that day, have met very suspicious deaths. There's this video on YouTube if you want to watch this to learn a bit more, but there's plenty of info out there about it. And then these next 3 slides are just kind of where are they now and what happened to the people involved after the JFK killing. I'm not going to read them just because there's a lot here, but you can pause the screen and read all of this if you want to kind of read up on this. It's really nothing too exciting here. Here's the second screen, and then here's the third screen. So that's the whole part about the JFK assassination and what went down there. And this entry is about a chapter in Howard Hughes' story, which has about 1 million strange chapters. But in 1967, Onassis has always enjoyed vast piles of money to be made through gambling in Monaco in the 1950s and in Cuba under Batista. Onassis took over Las Vegas in 1967 via the Hughes cover. U.S. government officials explained that it was all right because at least Hughes isn't the mafia. Note, L. Wayne Rector was hired around 1955 by the Carl Boyer PR agency to act as Hughes' double. In 1957, when Onassis grabbed Hughes, Rector continued to act as his stand-in. Rector was the Hughes surrogate in Las Vegas. Robert Mayhew actually ran the show. Mayhew got his orders from Onassis, and the 6 nursemaids called the Mormon Mafia, who we talked about earlier, kept Rector sealed off from prying eyes. So this did happen, and as I said, this is another really strange chapter in the Howard Hughes story. Around 1967, which is when Gemstone says this happened, Howard Hughes just started buying up a ton of casinos in Las Vegas. And it was where he was establishing a monopoly because he was buying up so many of these casinos and getting so much power and control in Las Vegas. These are just a few of the casinos that he bought. And it's always seemed, kind of strange just because he didn't have any sort of background working, with casinos or buying casinos or anything like that. He just kind of randomly decided when he was in his 60s that he's just going to start buying up a ton of casinos, and he ended up owning like 7 or 8 of them, I believe. Now, Gemstone is saying, well, this wasn't Howard Hughes doing anything. This was just the mafia, Robert Mayhew, directing these purchases on the behalf of Aristotle Onassis and buying up all these casinos on the behalf of the mafia. And obviously, Aristotle Onassis, if you remember, he did have a background with casinos. He owned the Casino Royale Casino in Monte Carlo. So it's just another very bizarre thing with Howard Hughes. He never came out of seclusion or anything like that when he bought these casinos. It was all done through Robert Mayhew. And he ended up being, I think, at one point, he was the biggest landowner in all of Nevada. And so this is when we start getting into the Robert Kennedy assassination. So June 17, 1968, Bobby Kennedy knew who killed his brother. He wrote about it in his unpublished book, The Enemy from Within. When he foolishly tried to run for president, Onassis off using a sophisticated new technique, hypnotized Sirhan, shooting from the front, security guard from Lockheed Aircraft, Thane Caesar, shooting from 2 or 3 inches away from Bobby's head from the rear. Sirhan's shots all missed, but Caesar's couldn't possibly miss. Evel Younger, then the Los Angeles district attorney, covered it up, including the squawks of LA Coroner Thomas Noguchi. Younger was rewarded with the post of California Attorney General later. His son Eric Younger got a second-generation mafia reward, a judgeship at age 30. See Ted Chirac, LA author and director, The Second Gun, a documentary film on the RFK murder, bought and suppressed by Warner Brothers for more details. Ted Kennedy knew who did it. He ran to Onassis, afraid for his life, and swore eternal obedience. In return, Onassis granted him his life and said he could be president too, just like his big brother, if he would just behave himself and follow orders. So Gemstone identifies this guy, Thane Caesar, as the person who actually killed Robert Kennedy, not Sirhan. And it's interesting because, just fairly recently, actually, Robert Kennedy Jr. identified this Thane Caesar person as the he believes killed his father. And again, Gemstone was written, all the way back in the mid-70s, only just a few years after Robert Kennedy was killed. And so, the fact that Gemstone identified Thane Caesar as the killer so long ago is pretty interesting. And then, if you look at the evidence, there was kind of all this talk at the time, especially from the coroner, his name is Thomas Noguchi, about the fact that there was a second gunman. The autopsy indicated that there was a second person who fired bullets, and it couldn't have just been Sirhan. And then it's also interesting that this guy, Thane Caesar, has some interesting connections to some of the people we've been talking about. So in this book on the top, this author, Lisa Peace, wrote that Caesar previously worked for Robert Mayhew in Los Angeles. So Caesar has a connection to Bob Mayhew, who was controlling this Howard Hughes empire. And then it's also interesting because right after this assassination happened, according to this book, Caesar was hired by Hughes Aircraft. So again, another connection to Howard Hughes, almost like this, could have been like some sort of payoff after the assassination happened. I just found out about this book, and so I haven't had a chance to read it, but I wanted to just include this. This book came out 10 years ago or so, but apparently it's a pretty good book, and it identifies Aristotle Onassis as the person who is responsible for the Robert Kennedy killing. As I said, I haven't read it yet or anything, but I just wanted to mention that I'm planning on reading it. But then also Gemstone identifies this guy L. Younger as the person who kind of covered this whole thing up, and he was rewarded by being named the California Attorney General. This did happen. He was named Attorney General in 1971, right after this. And it also says that a part of L. Younger's reward as well is that his son, Eric Younger, was named a judge at age 30. And again, this did happen too. Eric Younger was named a judge in 1974. And again, like, it's just kind of really minor details about this that aren't details that just aren't commonly known that are included in Gemstone that leads me to believe that there's at least somewhat of it has at least some credibility, and Bruce Roberts had some sort of connections or someone feeding him this information, because it's just such a random, bit of information to say that Ella Younger's son was given a judgeship at age 30, which, basically no one actually knew that. If you look into it, it did actually happen. And then Gemstone also mentions this documentary. You can find it on YouTube. It's really good. It's considered one of the better documentaries about the Robert Kennedy killing. It's called The Second Gun. And this is one of the more explosive and definitely controversial claims the Gemstone file makes. In October 1968, Jackie Kennedy was now free to marry Aristotle Onassis. It's an old mafia rule. Someone welches on a deal, you kill him, and you take his gun and his girl. In this case, Jackie and the Pentagon. Basically, it's saying that Jackie Kennedy, who ended up marrying Aristotle Onassis, didn't marry him out of luck or anything. She married him because she was essentially forced to, due to this old mafia code that if someone screws you on a deal, you kill him and you take his girl. Personally, I've never heard of this mafia code. Maybe it is a thing, and people like in the know have actually heard of it. But definitely, this claim that Jackie Kennedy was basically forced to marry Aristotle Onassis is, definitely hard to believe. At any rate, it is a strange marriage. You do have to admit that. Jackie Kennedy was only 39. She was young, absolutely gorgeous, very rich herself. She was very well off, and probably considered like one of the most desirable bachelorettes in the world at the time. And she marries Aristotle Onassis, who was almost twice her age. He lived halfway across the world on a private island. And so she basically had to just throw her life away, and this island was halfway across the world, and, start over and have a brand new life. So it was definitely a strange marriage for a number of reasons. That being said, it's still pretty hard to believe. But then there's this whole mystery about her, just week before JFK was killed, her husband was killed, she was hanging out with Aristotle Onassis on his yacht. And there was a big mystery about they didn't know where the yacht was, and they couldn't find Jackie Kennedy. And this was just right before JFK was killed. So again, there's a lot of just really weird things about this statement and this claim, but hey, who knows? And so now we get into the Chappaquiddick incident. I'll go over what it is real quick, because I feel like this isn't as well known as maybe the JFK or Robert Kennedy assassination. So basically, the Chappaquiddick incident was this girl in the upper left, Mary Jo Kopechny. She worked for Robert Kennedy when he was still alive. And she was at a party after he had died, and Ted Kennedy was there. Ted Kennedy was Robert and JFK's brother. Ted Kennedy drove her to the ferry so she could leave. The place is an island, and the only way to get off the island is a ferry. And he crashed his car in a lake, and the car sunk. Ted Kennedy escaped and swam to safety. Mary Jo Kopechny, who was in the car, drowned and died. And then there was all this like weird stuff going on. It took him like 10 or 11 hours before he actually reported the crime to police, almost a half day before he reported that he'd been in a car wreck and there was a dead body in the car. So it's a very weird situation. And Gemstone has some pretty interesting explanations for what happened. So it says in 1969, Mary Jo Kopechne, devoted JFK girl and one of Bobby's trusted aides, was in charge of packing up his files after his assassination in LA. She read too much, learned about the Kennedy Mafia involvement and other things. She said to friends, "This isn't Camelot, this is murder." She died trying to get off Chappaquiddick Island, where she had overheard, along with everyone else in the room, Ted Kennedy's end of a telephone call from John Tunney and a phone call to Joe Alioto and Democratic bigwigs Swig, Shorenstein, Schumann, and Bechtel. Teddy's good friend John Tunney called to complain that Alioto's mafia friend Cyril Magnan and others had tried to bribe Jess Unruh to switch from the governor. It's a lot of names here, but I'll explain it in the next line or the next slide. To bribe Jess Unruh to switch from the governor's race to run for the Senate for the seat that John Tunney wanted, so that Alioto would have an easier run for governor. He called Alioto, who told him to go to hell. Then Teddy called the rest to arrange for yet another mafia murder. Okay, so that was a lot of names. It was kind of confusing, but I'll try to explain it very simply. So basically, this dude on the left, Joe Alioto, was the mayor of San Francisco for a number of years, for a pretty long time. He wanted to run for governor of California, and he was going to be running against this guy on the left, Jesse Unruh, who was a very popular politician at the time. Gemstone is saying that Joe Alioto bribed Jesse Unruh to drop out of the governor race and instead run for Senate of California. And so they wanted him to run for Senate instead. If he ran for Senate, he'd be opposing this guy whose name is John Tunney. John Tunney was, you can see that he was the roommate of Ted Kennedy at law school, and he was also one of his best friends. So again, instead of this guy Jess Unruh, instead of running for governor against Joe Alioto, he was paid off to drop out of that race and run for Senate against this guy. And this guy John Tunney was pissed because it would be a harder way to get elected running up against Jess Unruh. And so this guy John Tunney, who was Ted Kennedy, one of Ted Kennedy's best friends, called him on Chappaquiddick and complained about this Joe Alioto paying off Jess Unruh to run for Senate instead. And Ted Kennedy on the Chappaquiddick Island called Joe Alioto, and Gemstone claims he threatened him and bitched him out. And then this Joe Alioto guy got pissed and told him to go to hell. And then Ted Kennedy apparently arranged for him to be either roughed up or even murdered, it sounds like. And Mary Jo Kopechne overheard the entire thing. And so that's why this continues on with the entry. So Mary Jo ran into the cottage. Drunken Teddy offered to drive her to the ferry. Wanting to get away from curious sheriff look, Teddy sped off the bridge, toward the bridge, busted Mary Jo's nose when she tried to grab his arm from the back seat, and bailed out of the car as it went off the bridge. Mary Jo was still pounding on the upturned floorboards of Teddy's car while Teddy called Jackie and Onassis on the Christina. Teddy also called Catherine or Graham, lawyers, etc. Jackie called the Pope on Teddy's behalf, who assigned Cardinal Cushing to help. The next morning, the first person Teddy tried to call after deciding he'd have to take the rap himself was lawyer Burke Marshall, Onassis' friend in the U.S. on the ships deal back in the 40s. And also the designated custodian for JFK's brains after Dallas. The brains have disappeared. So this guy Marshall is who kind of represented, he was a lawyer, and he kind of represented Ted Kennedy in this. And this is true that he was in charge of safekeeping JFK's brain after he'd been assassinated, and it just went missing. And still to this day, it's like a mystery. No one really knows what happened to JFK's brain. So continuing on with Chappaquiddick, John Tunney's sister, Joan, heard her brother's phone call made from her house in Tiburon to the Chappaquiddick cottage. The next day after Mary Jo died, Joan ran away to Norway, where she was kidnapped by mafia hoods Mari and Adamo. They locked her up in a Marcellus heroin factory for 6 years, where heroin fumes turned her into a junkie. No needle marks. Then they turned her loose outside the factory. Joan's husband complained, so she chopped his head off with an axe and was subsequently locked up in a nut house belonging to the Marquise of Blandford, then Tina Lovano Onassis' husband. Mario and Adamo got pressed into scrap metal in the New Jersey auto junkyard. So this is kind of a confusing entry, but this guy John Tunney, who was Ted Kennedy's college roommate and one of his best friends, he was the one who supposedly called Chappaquiddick that night to complain to Ted Kennedy about this election for Senate that he was involved in. And he called from California where he lived. And Gemstone claims his sister, whose name was Joan Tunney, overheard this phone call, overheard Ted Kennedy saying basically they were going to get some really bad people involved to, take care of this Joe Alioto guy. And it's kind of an interesting little thing. This is a really weird story, like insanely weird story. So right after this happened, right after Chappaquiddick happened, this girl, John Tunney's sister, went missing. And it was kind of a big deal because this John Tunney's dad was named Gene Tunney. He was a famous boxer back in his time. He was pretty well known. And this girl, Joan Tunney, went missing in Europe, and no one knew where she was. No one knew where she was. She went missing. She went missing for 2 months. And if you go back to the Gemstone entry, it says that she was locked up in a heroin factory for 60 days, and heroin fumes turned her into a total junkie. And she did go missing for 60 days, just randomly. No one could find her. No one knew it happened. And then she finally did appear after 2 months, and she claimed she had complete memory loss. She didn't remember anything at all. Didn't know where she was, who she was with, nothing at all. She said she didn't remember anything. And then the strangest part is right after she reappeared, she killed her husband with an axe and practically chopped his head off. The attack was so severe. And it was even said in this article about it that her friend says she hasn't been well, since she went missing for 2 months. So this is just a insanely weird story that Ted Kennedy's, right after the Chappaquiddick incident happens, Ted Kennedy's college roommate and his best friend, that guy's sister, just basically goes missing for 2 months, appears and doesn't remember anything at all. And then after she's reappeared, she chops the head off of her husband. So it's very, very strange. And so here's the story about her fessing up to killing her husband and going to an insane asylum. And so this is just a slide, a Gemstone recap of what they say, who kind of was involved in the cover-up and how they helped cover up the Chappaquiddick thing. I won't get into this. I won't read this. You can pause the screen if you want to read it. There's nothing too interesting here. So in the panic of trying to cover up Teddy's guilt at Chappaquiddick, many things became unglued. The JFK murder threatened to creep out of the woodwork again. Black Panthers Hampton and Clark were murdered. Chicago cops fired over Attorney Charles Gary's because of what they knew about the JFK murder squad's presence in Chicago on November 1st, 1963. So this is really interesting because the murder of Fred Hampton is, a pretty notorious case. He was a Black Panther, and a whole bunch of Chicago cops busted into his house and fired like 100 bullets and just basically blew him away, murdered this other Black Panther, Mark Clark. It's a pretty well-known case. It was very, very heavily covered at the time. And it's always been kind of strange because, it just sort of like happened for no reason that they, busted into his house and started shooting. But what James is saying is that Fred Hampton, they were killed in Chicago. And what Gemstone is saying is Fred Hampton and Mark Clark knew about the Chicago plot to kill JFK 3 weeks before he was killed in Dallas. They knew a lot of who was involved in all these secrets. And maybe they were threatening to, expose it. And it's interesting because one of the primary players in the Chicago plot to kill JFK is this guy in the thumbnail, the black dude. His name was Abraham Bolden. He was the first Black Secret Service assigned to presidential protection. He was also based out of Chicago. So you do kind of wonder if, hey, maybe he knew Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and he was the one passing them info about this Chicago plot and passing them some info about like what was involved. But it's, you know, certainly interesting that they say the reason for the Fred Hampton murder was that he knew all about the plot to kill JFK. So at the end of 1970, Howard Hughes' presence on Earth was no longer required. We're back to Howard Hughes now. His handwriting could be duplicated by a computer. His biography, all the known facts about his life, had been compiled in a computerized biography issued to top Hughes executives. His double, Rector, had been doing Hughes for years, and Hughes was ill. Clifford Irving, author of Hoax about an art forger, became interested in Hughes. Living on Ibiza, he heard the Mediterranean gossip that Hughes was a hoax too. He went to Hughes' so-called Mormon Mafia, the 6 nursemaids, for information. One of them, Merriman, perhaps tired of the game, gave Irving the computerized Hughes biography. And from it, Irving wrote his own autobiography. So this is yet another insanely strange chapter to the Howard Hughes story. This guy, his name is Clifford Irving. He was a relatively well-known and successful writer at the time. And he lived on Ibiza, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. Aristotle Onassis also lived on an island in the Mediterranean Sea. And what this gemstone entry is saying is that there was kind of like gossip among, you know, people who knew things in the Mediterranean area about like the Howard Hughes thing being a hoax. And so Gemstone is saying that somehow Clifford Irving got in touch with one of these Mormon Mafia members, the people who were, you know, basically overseeing Howard Hughes, quote unquote, Howard Hughes and his empire. And so if you go back to the entry, they say that there was this computerized biography that had been compiled. So this was basically, a lot of people think it was kind of like the true story of what had happened to Howard Hughes. And they wrote everything down and just issued it just to like the really high up, you know, really important people who actually needed to know this, like the Mormon Mafia. I'm sure Robert Mayhew got a copy. Just a few people got this copy that actually told the true story of what Gemstone claims happened. And so anyway, Gemstone claims that somebody gave Clifford Irving this document that told the true story of, you know, the Howard Hughes kidnap. And from this document, he wrote a autobiography of Howard Hughes. This was a very big deal. This was like one of the biggest events in publishing history. They announced this biography of Howard Hughes that, you know, supposedly was going to be the true story. They paid McGraw-Hill, big publisher, paid $650,000 advance for the book, which is an absolutely astronomical sum, especially back in like 1971. Absolutely astronomical. And so they announced the book that it was coming out, and it was just met with this huge fanfare. This Clifford Irving's book, it was highly anticipated. And then there's kind of started being this chatter about, well, was this a hoax, or like what's going on here? How did Clifford Irving finally get to meet Howard Hughes when, you know, he's been banished for the past 15 years? So the Gemstone entry continues. Irving wrote his book, and the publishers announced it. Onassis knew someone had given Irving the information. He thought it was Mayhew and fired him in November of 1970. On Thanksgiving Eve 1970, in the middle of the night, Hughes made a well-publicized secret departure from Las Vegas to the Bahamas. So, you know, we've talked about Robert Mayhew quite a bit. He was overseeing the Howard Hughes empire, and then this is saying that this geometry is saying that Onassis suspected that Robert Mayhew was the guy who was passing information on to Clifford Irving to include in this biography. Onassis got pissed and he fired Robert Mayhew. Robert Mayhew was furious, and he tried to fight this firing because it was claimed that it was, you know, quote unquote Howard Hughes who fired Robert Mayhew. Robert Mayhew fought it and said like this wasn't valid, that, you know, the Hughes signature was forged on like the termination notice. And so it kind of turned into a big thing. And then this next entry in December of 1970, Onassis discovered his mistake and had Merriman killed. So Gemstone claims Mormon Mafia member Merriman, who I couldn't find anything about. It's really difficult to even just find any info on the Mormon Mafia. I couldn't find anything about this Merriman person. And it says, though Mayhew, accidentally deprived of his $500,000 annual salary, sued Hughes for millions, mentioning Hughes' game plan for purchase of presidents, governors, senators, judges, etc. Onassis paid off cheap at the price to maintain his custodianship of the American democracy and free world and keep from hanging from multiple murders. So this did happen. Robert Mayhew, after he was fired, he sued, quote unquote, Howard Hughes, and he was awarded like $3 million. On that, Gemstone is saying it was Onassis who paid the $3 million to Hughes. Guys, sort of like a payoff as hush money, basically, because he had fired him because he mistakenly thought that he was the one who was passing Clifford Irving all this information when it was in fact someone else. So in December 1970, the Hughes Mafia Party plus Rector fled around the world from the Bahamas, where they murdered an uncooperative governor and police chief in Nicaragua, where they shot a U.S. ambassador between the eyes for noticing there wasn't any Hughes. Then to Canada, where the Mormon Mafia nursemaid Beckersley, actually his name is Eckersley, the godly sum of swindle and the Canadian Stock Exchange, and on to London to the Rothschilds in the park. So this did happen, and it's yet another really strange chapter in the saga of Howard Hughes. Around this time, he just started jet setting around. Howard Hughes, supposedly started jet setting all around the world. He went from Vegas to the Bahamas, then they moved on to Nicaragua after a few months, stayed in Nicaragua for a few months, and they left there and went to London, stayed in London for a few months, went to Canada. And it's just kind of ridiculous because supposedly at the time Howard Hughes was just this old, decrepit man on the verge of dying, and he's just constantly flying around everywhere. And also after he was basically a recluse, a total hermit in his Las Vegas room for the past decade, and then all of a sudden he's moving all around the world. And kind of one of the main reasons this started happening was around this time people did kind of start to get suspicious and start to wonder about this whole Howard Hughes story and if he was even still alive, because there were some lawsuits that were filed that he wasn't appearing for, and there started to be newspaper articles and magazine articles kind of wondering about Howard Hughes and wondering why he was just constantly jet setting around the world. So it was around this time that some people at least, started being just a little suspicious of this Howard Hughes story. And so the next entry on April 18th, 1971, Howard Hughes, a human vegetable, as the result of serious brain damage during his 1957 hustle, plus 14 years of heroin, grew sicker and sicker. A final overdose of heroin did him in. His coffin was lowered into the sea from Rocky Headland off the coast of Scorpios. Present at the funeral were Jackie Kennedy Onassis, Teddy Kennedy, Francis Dale, director of CREEP, and on the ITT board of directors, Tom Pappas, and a South Vietnamese cardinal named Thuc. Onassis allowed some pictures to be taken from a distance. He himself did not appear. Pictures were published in Midnight, a Canadian tabloid. And we've showed these pictures previously, but these pictures were snapped by a tourist whose tour boat was passing Scorpios, and there was this really old, just decrepit guy, basically on the verge of death. He was in a wheelchair. He was being helped to walk. That is Jackie Kennedy on the left there. She's helping him in that first picture. And then in the second picture, she's just standing there as he's kind of being led away from the wheelchair by these two guys. So the next entry says, on the day Howard Hughes was buried, Clifford Irving's wife presented a publisher's check made out to Howard Hughes, made out to H. Hughes, to Onassis' bank for payment. Onassis paid off cheap at the price. So this is the final in this really weird Clifford Irving story. All of a sudden, kind of after there was this announcement of the autobiography and all this hoopla around it, Clifford Irving announced, well, but the whole thing was a hoax. And Clifford Irving was just really drugged through the mud. He claimed he just basically made the whole thing up. He was supposedly forced to pay back his advance. He was called the Con Man of the Year on the cover of Time magazine. And one of the strange things that happened is that this $650,000 that supposedly was the advance that was paid to Clifford Irving, there was security cam footage of, the check was only made out to H. Hughes. It wasn't made out to Howard Hughes. It was made out to H. Hughes. And so there was security cam footage of a girl going and depositing the check in a Swiss bank account. And she identified herself as Helga Hughes. And later on, it came out that this girl was Clifford Irving's wife. Her name was, I don't know her name. I actually can't remember her name. Later came out that Clifford Irving's wife was the one who was cashing this check and identifying herself as Helga Hughes. And it's just a really strange story that after that happened, it was deemed that this was a hoax. Basically, what Gemstone is saying is that this $650,000 was a payoff from Onassis for Clifford Irving just to keep his mouth shut and go away and not do anything with his book. It's a really weird story. Hopefully I did a decent job of explaining it. I will go into this in a lot of detail in the Howard Hughes that I'm working on now. So the dope trade routes are, this is Gemstone again, the dope trade routes are Golden Triangle to Taiwan to San Francisco. Heroin coming in from the Golden Triangle was sometimes smuggled into San Francisco in the bodies of American GIs who died in battle in Vietnam. One body can hold up to 40 pounds of heroin crammed in where the guts could be. And again, this is something that Gemstone, totally nails. And it was written just right after, the Vietnam War ended. But if there's plenty of articles out there about how heroin was smuggled into the U.S. in dead U.S. soldiers' bodies. There's this movie, American Gangster, Denzel Washington. It's about this guy, Frank Lucas, who did fight in the Vietnam War, and he smuggled a whole bunch of heroin back. And he's very upfront saying that they built coffins that had fake bottoms where they would stuff a bunch of heroin in there and then ship it back to the U.S. and access the heroin that way. So again, Gemstone was right on that one. And these next two entries just go into a lot more detail on these dope trade routes and how the drug trade works. I won't read them all off just because they're a little lengthy, but you can pause the video and read them up if you want to. There's the first screen, and then there's the second one. The second one is interesting because it mentions a cola factory in Laos that is actually, in reality, a heroin factory. The whole Pepsi Cola thing is just a front. And that's actually the plot of this Air America Mel Gibson movie that's from like 1990 or so. So it's interesting that the movie is about this Air America that flew drugs for the CIA during the Vietnam War. And it's interesting they bring that up. And those two entries are also interesting just because they basically nail what these drug trade routes were. Somebody was clearly giving Bruce Roberts some pretty good intel, because a lot of these drug trade routes did not come out for a number of years, but he, pretty much nails them in those two entries. So in 1971, folk hero Daniel Ellsberg, well known from the Rand Corp, who had designed the missile ring around the Iron Curtain countries, was told to release the faked up Pentagon Papers to distract people from JFK, RFK, MLK, etc. The papers were carefully designed by Ellsberg and his boss, Rand chief and now World Bank chief Bob Body Count McNamara, to make the Vietnamese War look like just one of those incredibly dumb mistakes. This helped to cover up the real purpose of the war: continued control for Onassis and his friends of the Gold Triangle dope trade, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and for Onassis and the oil people of Eastern oil sources. So this did happen around the time this guy Daniel Ellsberg released these papers called the Pentagon Papers, which supposedly told like the true story of the Vietnam War. It was a really big deal. And what the Gemstone File is saying is that these Pentagon Papers was just kind of like almost a distraction, because at the time people were, the Vietnam War was still going on. People were still dying in it. And people started getting kind of a little suspicious that so much of the heroin And the opium comes out of this Vietnam area, which is, where all this fighting was going on and where this war was happening. And so people really started questioning, is this just a drug war? And so these Pentagon papers were supposedly, or they were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, and they supposedly told the true story of why we got into the Vietnam War and kind of portrayed it as just a big mistake. And what Gemstone is saying is that was done on purpose to kind of distract people and keep them busy looking into something like this, as opposed to looking into the drug trade and everything that was going on with that during the war. And this is where we start getting into Watergate, and I think I'm just going to kind of scroll through these entries and not go into too much detail. I'll be honest, personally, I do not know hardly anything about Watergate. I know the basics, but I've never really looked into it. It's always kind of seemed like just very insignificant compared to like the Kennedy assassination or some of these other assassinations, like a couple phones were bugged in Washington, D.C., which doesn't really seem like that big of a deal because probably every phone is bugged in Washington, D.C. But anyway, I will, just kind of scroll through these. And if you're interested in reading about what Gemstone has to say about Watergate, you can just, kind of pause the screen and read it. So here's the first entry. Here's another one. This is the team that identifies. And it basically identifies a team that was put together for the Bay of Pigs. Gemstone says that the team that was, put together for the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba a few years earlier was just kind of repurposed to pull off this Watergate break-in, much in the same way that what we had talked about earlier, how the assassination team that was put together to kill Fidel Castro was then just repurposed to kill JFK. They just used an existing team of people. They didn't go out and recruit all these new people. Another entry on Watergate. And here's one more. And this is interesting. And so I wanted to read off this entry just because I thought it was a good one. So Gemstone is asking a question. Why the intense battle between mafia forces? Answer. Well, Onassis was the recognized crowned head of the mafia. Intense no-holds-barred scuffling for the lucrative second spot, control of the U.S. presidency, government, and so on, was permissible and encouraged under the Mafia Code of Rules. The only stipulation, outsiders mustn't know about it. Hughes contributed liberally and equally to both Democrats and Republican parties for the 1972 election. The winner would give even more money from Hughes. So basically it's saying that like the mafia is structured where there's the recognized head of the mafia and there's these families under him. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they battle each other to kind of be named second or third in command or whatever it is. This movie on Netflix, it's called New York versus the Mafia. It does a really good job of basically explaining exactly what Gemstone talked about here. This is a really good documentary, so I would definitely recommend checking that one out. Here's another break-in or another entry in Watergate. This guy, Hal Lisbeth, was a private investigator who Gemstone identifies as the person who kind of was behind this whole thing. Not behind the whole thing, but was heavily involved. And so I've found a few things on him. Another entry on Watergate. So this entry is about one of the big mysteries about Watergate is that they had these tapes of transcriptions of the phone calls that Richard Nixon was making. And one of the phone calls, there was like 19 minutes, 18 and a half minutes that was just erased. And nobody knows what was on this 18 and a half minutes. It's always been this huge mystery. This is his secretary, Rosemary Woods. She claimed this device she was using was like some sort of transcription device. There's pedals on the ground. And then she claims the phone rang and she reached over to get the phone and kept her foot on the pedal. The pedals like control. I don't know how it works, but it's something to do with the pedals control how to erase or transcribe things. Fast forward, rewind the tapes maybe. At any rate, she was working on this device, and the phone rang, and she kept her foot on the pedal and reached over to get the phone, and she kind of demonstrated for the media, and then that accidentally missed the tape, and she demonstrated for the media how she did it. It's always kind of been like a joke of a photograph. You can even see like her right arm there is like hanging on to the chair for dear life, so she doesn't tip over. But that's always been kind of one of the big mysteries around, or one of the, it's definitely one of the mysteries around Watergate. This injury was interesting. So it's about this secretary, Beverly Kay, who mysteriously died right before she was going to testify in Watergate. And her testimony was said to be, it would have been one of the most damaging testimonies at the hearings. And she was murdered. But Gemstone claims she actually heard the 18, there's like a copy of the tape, that the portion of the tape that was released. She heard it, and she was murdered for that. I think she had a heart attack at age 40, so a little suspicious. And then this is 4 people who died in January 1973. So Lyndon Johnson, sodium morphate heart attack at his ranch on the Pedernales River. Alexander Onassis, who was Aristotle Onassis' son, his plane crashed via fixed altimeter at the Athens airport. Eugene Wynham, California Democratic Party chairman and JFK assassination payoff bag man, heart attack. And L. Wayne Rector, who was always identified as Howard Hughes' double, was killed at the Rothschilds in the park in London. Here's another entry on Watergate and another entry on Watergate. You can pause if you want to read these. Onassis. So on August 6, 1974, Nixon and Ford signed a paper at the White House. It was an agreement. Ford could be president. Nixon got to burn his tapes and files and murder anyone he needed to cover it all up. August 8, 1974, Nixon stepped down and Ford stepped up to keep the cover-up going. And this is an interesting entry. So on August 30th, 1974, San Francisco zebra murders, a series of random killings dubbed the zebra murders by the police because supposedly black people were killing white people. The real target was Silva, the witness to Aliato's mafia nut treating. Silva was shot to death in an alley. Careful mafia planning went into this series to kill several birds with one stone. Get witnesses Silva out of the way without being too obvious about it, spread the fear of black terrorists, and convince people that the police department needed more money and more repressive power, blame and frame black Muslims, knock off leaders of the opposition. So this did happen. It's a really messed up story. Supposedly, there was this group of black people going around San Francisco and just randomly and killing white people at random. And they supposedly had like a leaderboard and had the point system and everything. Like 15 people officially died in the span of about a year, but there were estimates that the number was like 5-6 times that. 80 up to 80 people actually were killed by this group. That's the official story, at least. It was a really big deal. There were just constant fear-mongering articles. But the official story is that there was this group of black kids going around just killing white people at random. Gemstone says that's, just totally lie, totally made up. And one of the reasons that this gemstone was pulled off was there was this private eye. His name was Raymond Silva. Here he is. And he had been hired to follow San Francisco Mayor Joe Aliato around. And apparently he captured him doing something pretty bad or something he wasn't supposed to do. And so Gemstone says that one of the reasons for this is they wanted to get rid of this guy and not make it too obvious because he was killed right before he could testify. Another thing Gemstone says was part of the reason for these zebra murders being concocted was the mafia wanted to eliminate competition. So I don't know if some of these people, were drug dealers who weren't, paying up or paying their dues to the mafia or were getting their drugs from other sources. And the mafia wanted to eliminate them and eliminate the competition. So they just kind of created this whole thing. But this is definitely an interesting, very bizarre case. Maybe I'll do a future video on it. So on September 8th, 1974, Ford pardons Nixon for all crimes committed from January 20th through August. In October 1974, Ford drops extradition of Hughes from the Bahamas. Explanation: we dropped it because we knew he wouldn't come. That's for sure. So again, like right around this time, Howard Hughes, supposedly he was, officially he was this like decrepit old man on the verge of dying. But he was also being jet setted around the world by his team. They went from the Bahamas to Nicaragua to London to a couple other different places. And it was kind of around this time that there was like a little chatter and a few newspaper articles about, well, is Howard Hughes actually even alive? And so there was some sort of lawsuit, and they were trying to extradite him from Panama or from the Bahamas. And eventually this was just called off. They didn't even try to do it. And, the evidence seems to indicate that there was no Howard Hughes at this time, and that's what Gemstone claims too. So losing his son Alexander took all the fun out of killing for Onassis, who was there to inherit the world empire he had dreamed of handing over to his son. So Aristotle Onassis' son Alexander, he was only in like his 20s. He was pretty young. He died around this time. Plane crash. Gemstone claims that the plane was messed with. But this is one of the last entries on Onassis here. So December 1974, Brezhnev's meeting with the Diet of Egypt. The outcome wouldn't help the U.S. no matter how many trips Henry Kissinger made to the Middle East with clean socks and blank checks. A new U.S. secret weapon was apparently used. A tiny speck of metal introduced somehow into Brezhnev's lymph system. It lodged in the cluster of lymph nodes over his heart, and there was Koto.
Numbered group of law enforcement. Do you know how all those cops went up in front of the American people to the January 6th commission talking about how traumatized they were? Remember this guy? Among the vastly outnumbered group of law enforcement officers protecting the Capitol and the people inside it, I was grabbed, beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. Yeah, that guy. Well, that guy was actually not in uniform. He was not there as a Capitol Police officer. He was there as an FBI client.
The dude was there. carrying a Confederate flag. You can't make it up. It's him, and he thought he was going to get away with it.
Once again,
Okay, so I figured it out. My audio was muted. Damn it. So, Mr. Xavier, thank you for that. God, I'm like 2.5 hours in. I hope that people were hearing the videos. But I mean, at least I fixed it.
unraveling of the narrative, because the narrative wasn't strong because it wasn't true. So we can try again. Try again. But guess what, guys? Release the FBI files and you will see who's really guilty.
All right, so I want to show that one. I really hope that you were able to see or hear the videos. If someone could confirm that the actual videos were able to be heard. Okay, good. So like all my commentary and reading off things were not being heard. Great. The world population hoax, the United Nations World Population Count hoax.
The official number.
So I was talking about the Canadian energy sector or Canadian imports and exports and our trade with the US and how like we're not factoring in the carbon footprint Canadians are incurring with our exports to the US, things like the oil, gas, lumber, hydroelectricity, things like that. And that's counted in our carbon footprint. And lumber trade, especially lumber, like it's also used to build a lot of homes in the US and Canada as well, but the US as well. So there's a lot more to that as well. And we're doing more trade with China. They are, I think, our second, like we export second to them our lumber. And we could be doing more of that. And they also do they do a lot of trade with China, and there's a lot of supplies being goods and services being and people in the manufacturing industry that are also coming out of China and India, major polluters of the world, huge carbon footprint, whatever you want to call it. Pollution footprint is what I like to call it. Again, like over industrialized, over consumers, and so I just think we can leverage possibly like what he's talking about, Trump, I'm talking about with this 25% tariff. And Justin Trudeau and again, this finance minister, whoever it is right now, because Christian Freeland stepped down. But still talking about carbon taxing Canadians and what else was it? Oh, yeah. And so the way they want to get out of this is printing money. Giving more money to Canadians is what they're saying, just like we did during the pandemic. And again, it's going to devalue the Canadian dollar further. And again, it's not going to help. It's short-term pain for long-term more pain, I mean, and it's ridiculous. But anyways, I want to not talk about that anymore. I want to get into the world population hoax. I've talked about this before, but this is another good video.
Numbers for world population released by the United Nations as of now have just surpassed 8 billion people living on Earth. In 1800, there were only 900 million members of the human family spread across the world, raising 1.65 billion in 1900 and skyrocketing to nearly 7 billion in the year 2000. Now, in 2023, we have allegedly just passed the 8 billion mark. Given past failures and the many lies spewed by the UN during recent world events, however, it is fair and justified to remain skeptical of such statistics and to do some independent investigation before blindly believing. By collecting official statistics and doing your own math, it is difficult to find a way for these numbers to add up. For example, India supposedly has a countrywide population of well over 1.4 billion citizens. Practical calculations are made using the UN's own numbers. How they could possibly conclude such a high figure is clear as mud. Taking their official figure of populations from the largest 300 cities in India, from 12.4 million in the biggest city Mumbai to just over 100,000 in the 300th placed city of Aurangabad, and adding them all together, that barely accounts for 200 million of this supposed 1.4 billion. If all the 300 places with the largest populations in India taken together only account for 200 million people, It is statistically and geographically impossible for there to be another 7 times this number mysteriously hiding out in the remaining small towns and villages with populations all lower than 100,000. A similar situation occurs when adding up the official figures for the entire world's 300 most populated cities. Taking the UN's own official statistics, 24.1 million in the world's largest city of Shanghai, China, to only 361,000 people in the 300th largest city of Beirut, Lebanon. The combined figures only come out to approximately 1 billion people.
My
Even after
calculations is
adding
with
all the
1.5
statistics
billion.
calculated for surrounding metropolitan and suburban housing areas around each city, the total only amounts to around 1.5 billion.
Same calculation.
Where are these other alleged 6.5 billion people hiding? Being generous, independent analysts have estimated at most another billion people could possibly be spread out across the world's rural countrysides, still putting the actual number below 3 billion. The likely reason for these exaggerated statistics is that governments are incentivized to lie about population figures in order to collect more money for social programs. Then, by raising population figures to shocking levels, fear is created in the minds of the masses. They are even easily able to control and sell us on expensive, enslaving solutions. This hoax has resulted in billions of dollars spent fighting the phantom of so-called overpopulation, and led to many inhumane population control programs. In reality, however, if everyone were all squeezed into a population density of 27,000 per square mile, which is comparable to New York City, 8 billion people would only fill up the state of Texas, leaving the entire rest of the world uninhabited. Thus, the idea that Earth is dangerously overpopulated and governments need to take drastic measures to combat the issue is another paper tiger attempting to scare us into submission. Overpopulation concerns led China to enact a brutal one-child policy. Forced sterilization is a method of population control in some countries. Nearly 250,000 Peruvian women were sterilized. Our government, through the UN Population Fund, is involved in population moderation programs around the world, including in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, and Colombia.
And many other countries.
The greatest threat to mankind's prosperity is government, not
Well, and the NGOs that are affiliated with them, and anthropologists, Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Health Organization and WEF also involved internationally, going into countries, causing societal collapses from the inside out, exploiting resources and human experimentations, and again, forced inoculations that was causing outbreaks of illnesses and diseases and paralysis and so many other side effects, and again, not getting reported. And yeah, I just hope we're not heading towards the same. It's just quite ridiculous, really, what's been going on in the world. But anyways, I shared a lot about Tartaria, about hidden empires and advanced civilizations using advanced technologies, including what I was talking about, these heat induction radiating orbs that can cause significant damage, and where these orbs, that we had seen, across the world. Is there any connections? Because they were saying that they were measuring or testing for radiation, measuring or testing for it, or were they radiating the energy that they were saying they were testing for? And anyway, very, very interesting. And these laser technologies and magnetic nuclear radiating energies, whatever you want to call them, that are being harnessed and utilized. It's they're the companies like the Howard Hughes and NASA and General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and these companies, and this is known, right? And people anyway, and so a lot on the go. And on so many different levels. Anyway, on that note, I will leave it at that. I'm glad that my sound is back on. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.